A child's cry cut through the silence of the mansion like a siren, a sharp sound of helplessness that had been echoing through the marble corridors for hours. Downstairs, Clara, the new housekeeper, felt every sob like a pang in her own chest. The head housekeeper, Carmen, just shook her head sadly. "The mistress is on edge again," she whispered. The mistress was Veronica, the stepmother of little Sophie, a girl whose suffering seemed to be the soundtrack of that cold, opulent house. Clara went up the stairs, the sound of crying guiding her, and found Veronica coming out of the room, her face a mask of irritation. "She's throwing a tantrum," the woman said with a coldness that chilled Clara's soul. "When she stops, you can start cleaning." And she left, leaving the child to her own pain. Moved by an instinct that went beyond her duties, Clara knocked gently on the door. "Sweetie, can I come in? I'm not going to scold you." The crying subsided, and she entered. She found Sophie, a little girl with brown hair and immense eyes, huddled on the floor, her face wet with tears. With a sweet voice, Clara introduced herself and asked why she was crying. The girl's answer was a whisper that revealed the depth of neglect in that house. Pointing to her tummy, she said, "It hurts." Clara then asked the question no one else seemed to have asked. "Are you hungry?" The girl just nodded, her eyes full of a sadness no child should know. It was 1 in the afternoon, and Sophie hadn't eaten anything yet. In the kitchen, as she prepared a simple sandwich, Clara saw little Sophie transform. The child, once a ball of suffering, now swung her little legs on the stool, her curious eyes following every movement. Upon receiving the food, she devoured it with the urgency of someone who didn't know when her next meal would be. And then, with her mouth still full, she looked at Clara and with shocking clarity gave her verdict. She pointed to the housekeeper and said, "You, good." Then she pointed upstairs. "Veronica, bad." In that instant, an unbreakable connection was forged, a silent pact of protection between the forgotten girl and the only person who had stopped to listen to what her crying really meant. A hungry child, a cruel stepmother, and a housekeeper who refuses to be indifferent. Can kindness flourish in the most toxic environment? If you believe that a simple act of compassion can change everything, subscribe to the channel and like this video to not miss this emotional story. Veronica's cruelty was a river of dammed-up pain, its source a wound she refused to heal. Years earlier, she too had dreamed of being a mother, but her dream had dissolved into a devastating loss. Every smile from Sophie, every small grace, was a dagger to her, a constant reminder of the child she never had. In her grief-fractured mind, her stepdaughter was not a little girl to be loved, but the personification of her own failure, the living daughter of another woman, occupying the place that should have been her son's. The neglect wasn't just forgetfulness, it was a passive form of rejection. She couldn't love the girl because, to love her, she would have to confront the ghost of her own empty crib. Veronica's plan, whispered in secret phone calls that Clara would begin to overhear, was even darker than simple neglect. She didn't just want Sophie to be invisible, she wanted the girl to disappear completely. The goal was to create a narrative, to prove to Richard that his daughter was a difficult child with behavioral problems, who needed to be sent away to a boarding school, a special school far from their sight. Thus, with the girl out of the way, she and Richard could finally start their real family. Every act of cruelty, every harsh word was a brick in the construction of this fraudulent case, an attempt to turn the victim into the culprit to justify her exile. What Veronica, in her selfishness, could not foresee was the immediate and deep connection between Clara and Sophie. Clara also carried the mark of absence. Orphaned of her mother at a very young age, she knew the geography of childhood loneliness. Looking into Sophie's eyes, she didn't just see her boss's daughter, she saw a reflection of herself, another little girl navigating the world without the map of a mother's love. The compassion she felt was instinctual, a need to offer what she herself had missed. The battle that was about to begin was not just for a job or for a child's safety. It was a personal fight to protect a younger version of herself. The house became a stage of two realities. When Richard was present, or on the phone, Veronica was the perfect stepmother. Her voice was sweet, her words full of a manufactured affection. Clara would hear her describe to her husband the wonderful day Sophie had had, how well she had eaten, how she had played, a complete fiction that masked the dark truth. It was a calculated performance to keep Richard at a distance, calm in his work bubble, while she, alone with the child, could reign with her tyranny of grief. Clara, the invisible housekeeper, was the only spectator who knew the truth behind that curtain of lies, and the knowledge filled her with a helpless rage. Veronica's cruelty manifested in the details, in small acts of psychological terror that undermined the child's self-esteem. One afternoon, as Sophie was putting away her toys, Veronica grabbed her by the arm with unnecessary force, leaving a red mark on her delicate skin. "Faster, you useless thing," she hissed. When the girl began to cry, the next blow was even crueler. "Stop that. Your father hates crybabies." From the doorway, Clara watched the scene, her heart pounding with fury. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to intervene, but she held back. She knew that a direct confrontation would result in her immediate dismissal, leaving Sophie completely at the mercy of that woman. Later, in a quiet moment, Sophie showed the red mark on her arm to Clara. "It hurts," she whispered. Clara hugged her, her heart breaking. "You have to tell your father, my love." The girl's response was proof of the depth of Veronica's manipulation. "I can't," Sophie said, her eyes wide with fear. "Why?" "Because Daddy will give me away to other people if I'm not a good girl." The threat was monstrous. Veronica wasn't just mistreating the child, she was using a young orphan's greatest fear of being abandoned again as a tool of control, an invisible chain that ensured her silence and obedience. A chill ran down Clara's spine. This wasn't just neglect, it was systematic psychological torture designed to break a 7-year-old spirit. She needed proof, something she could show Richard, something he couldn't ignore. She remembered Sophie's drawings. Carefully, she gave the girl paper and crayons. "Draw for me what happened today." The child, with hesitant strokes, drew a large blonde-haired figure tightly gripping the arm of a small, crying figure. It was a silent confession, a testimony in the form of art. Clara took the drawing and saved it. It was her first piece of evidence, the first round of ammunition in the war. She now knew she had to fight for Sophie. On the other side of this silent war, Richard lived in a self-imposed exile. He buried himself in work, using the long hours at the office as a trench to protect himself from the pain that awaited him at home. He loved his daughter, but every look at Sophie was a reminder of the wife he had lost, a wound he didn't know how to heal. So he delegated. He handed over his daughter's upbringing to Veronica, his new wife, believing that her structure and discipline would be best for a special child. He listened to Veronica's daily reports about Sophie's tantrums and difficulty and accepted it all, his guilt convincing him that his daughter's problems were a reflection of his own absence. But the seed of doubt began to sprout. One day, deciding to work from home, he began to observe the dynamics of the mansion, and what he saw deeply disturbed him. He saw how Veronica's presence seemed to suck the air out from around Sophie, turning her into a tense, quiet, and frightened little girl. And he saw how, in the moments with Clara, the housekeeper, his daughter transformed. With her, Sophie learned, played, smiled. He witnessed Clara turn the task of putting away toys, which with Veronica was a cause for scolding, into a fun game of sorting colors. The difficult child his wife described didn't exist. There were two Sophies, and the happy version only appeared when Veronica wasn't around. That night, he confronted his wife, his voice laden with a confusion he could barely articulate. "I saw Sophie today. She was happy, learning things with Clara. Veronica's reaction was immediate and defensive. That's exactly what worries me, Richard. This woman is making her agitated without boundaries. Children like Sophie need routine, calm. She, with her manipulative skill, transformed the girl's joy into a symptom of disorder, Clara's positive influence into a danger. Richard was torn. The evidence of his eyes showed him a thriving daughter, but his wife's words painted a picture of risk and confusion. And he, lost, didn't know who to believe. Doubt, once planted, became an obsession for Richard. He needed the truth from an external source, untainted by the tense atmosphere of his home. The next morning he did something he hadn't done in years. He paid an unannounced visit to Sophie's school. He sat down opposite her teacher, an experienced woman with a kind gaze, and asked for an honest report on his daughter's development. That act was the seed of his turnaround. The father, who had long hidden behind his pain and his work, was finally taking the reins, beginning his own secret investigation to uncover the truth about his daughter's life. The teacher's report was an earthquake that shook the foundations of Richard's world. "Sophie is exceptional," the woman said, her face lighting up. "One of the most dedicated, caring, and popular students in the class." The description was the polar opposite of the difficult and problematic child Veronica portrayed. "Tantrums, behavioral problems?" the teacher asked, confused. "Sophie is a model of kindness. We've never had a single complaint." Every word was a nail in the coffin of Veronica's lies. The truth was clear. His wife had been deliberately and systematically misrepresenting his own daughter to him. The final blow, the visual proof of the emotional truth, came in the form of a drawing. The teacher showed Richard a recent art project of Sophie's on family. In the center of the paper, 3 figures held hands, smiling under a bright sun. A tall man, a dark-haired woman, and a little girl. Below, the childish caption, "Daddy, Clara, and me." In a distant corner of the page, small, isolated and frowning, was a 4th, blonde-haired figure, whom the teacher identified as Veronica. That simple drawing was a map of his daughter's heart, a powerful declaration of who she considered her real family and who was the stranger in her home. Richard drove back home, the hum of the engine drowned out by the deafening sound of the truth in his mind. Everything clicked into place. Veronica's constant complaints, her attempts to push Clara away, her excuses to keep him away from Sophie. It wasn't care, it was control. It wasn't discipline, it was cruelty. He realized with a horror that left him breathless that he had been a passive accomplice in the psychological abuse of his own daughter. His grief and guilt had blinded him, allowing his wife's toxicity to fill the vacuum of his absence. The pain in his chest was different now. It was no longer the pain of grief, but the cold fury of a father who had just discovered that the monster was inside his own house. The truth has been revealed through the eyes of a child. Now, armed with proof, what will this father do to protect his daughter? If you believe in a father's strength to defend his family, share your story in the comments and subscribe to the channel, because justice is on its way. Veronica, sensing she was losing control over Richard, decided to play her last and cruelest card. She needed to destroy Clara's credibility in a way so definitive that Richard would have no choice but to side with her. One morning, she took her own gold bracelet, and making sure that little Sophie was watching from the doorway, hid the jewelry inside one of Clara's cleaning cloths. The plan was diabolical. She would force her own stepdaughter to become an eyewitness to a fabricated crime, using the child's innocence as the main weapon to incriminate the only person who gave her love. The trap wasn't just against Clara, it was a corruption of her own daughter's soul. Hours later, she executed her theater. "My God, my bracelet is gone!" she screamed, with a perfectly rehearsed panic. She insisted that everyone search the kitchen and called for Clara to help. The moment Clara innocently picked up the dishcloth, the gold bracelet clattered to the floor. "Thief!" Veronica shrieked, pointing her finger. "I knew it! Sophie, did you see? Your dear friend is a thief!" She turned to the child, expecting fear to make her agree. But at that exact instant, the front door opened. It was Richard. He had come home early, and from his place in the hallway, he had witnessed the entire scene unfold. "What is going on here?" Richard asked, his voice dangerously calm. Veronica ran to him. "Richard, thank goodness you're here. I caught her red-handed with my bracelet. Sophie saw everything." But Richard didn't look at his wife. He knelt in front of his daughter, who was trembling, caught between her fear of her stepmother and the safety of her father. "Sophie," he said, his voice soft, "tell me the truth, princess. What did you see?" The little girl looked at her father's confident face and then at Veronica's enraged expression. And then, with the courage that love gave her, she pointed her finger at her stepmother and delivered the sentence. "It wasn't Clara. It was her." Veronica put the bracelet in the cloth. The truth, spoken by the pure voice of a child, was devastating. "She's lying! The housekeeper manipulated her!" Veronica screamed, but her panic betrayed her. Richard stood up, his face a mask of cold judgment. "It's over!" "Veronica," he said, "I know everything. Your lies about her school, your attempts to keep us apart, and now this cruelty." He walked to the phone. "I tried to give you the benefit of the doubt. I tried to understand your pain. But you used my daughter to try to destroy an innocent person, and that I will never forgive." He picked up the phone and looked at her, his voice devoid of emotion. "Get your things and get out of my house. Now." The Queen had been dethroned. With Veronica's furious departure, a heavy but different silence took over the mansion. It was not the silence of pain, but the calm after the storm. Richard stood in the middle of the room, looking lost, like a man who has just woken up from a long and terrible nightmare. At his side, Clara was calming little Sophie, whose crying had finally stopped. In that moment, the hierarchies of the house dissolved. They were no longer the boss, the housekeeper, and the child. They were just three survivors, three souls who had been united by the cruelty of one woman and who now needed to find a way to rebuild the world she had broken. Their true journey was just beginning. The first stage of that journey was an act of profound humility. Richard approached Clara, his face marked with shame and regret. "Clara," he began, his voice choked, "there are no words to describe how sorry I am. I was blind. I was weak. I failed you, and worse, I failed my own daughter." He made no excuses, didn't blame his grief. He took full responsibility for his error. "Can you forgive me?" The request was not from a boss to an employee, but from a broken man to the strong woman who, in her quiet wisdom, had shown him the truth he refused to see. Clara's response was not of accusation, but of immense grace. "There is nothing to forgive, Mr. Sterling. You were also a victim of her lies." She adjusted Sophie in her lap, the girl now calm and safe. "The important thing now is Sophie. We need to think of her." Richard sat beside them on the sofa, and for the first time, the three of them were together in a genuine peace. The woman he had hired to clean his house had become the guardian of his daughter's heart, and somehow the anchor of his own sanity. In that moment, a new, unlikely family began to be born, not of blood or contract, but of a shared crisis. The days that followed were of a delicate reconstruction. Richard cancelled trips, started coming home earlier from work, and with a touching humility, asked Clara to teach him how to be a father. She taught him how to prepare Sophie's favorite meals, to understand her different types of cries, to tell bedtime stories. And he, the powerful CEO, became a dedicated student in the most important subject of his life. The mansion, once a place of rigid rules and oppressive silence, began to fill with laughter, with games on the living room floor, with the smell of homemade food. It was slowly ceasing to be a house and becoming a home. Richard's deepest. Transformation happened one evening as he watched Clara and Sophie in the garden, planting tiny seeds in a flower bed. And he understood. For years he had tried to fill the void in his home with expensive objects, with staff, with a new wife who fit into his world of status. But the real wealth, the cure for his family's loneliness, was not in any of that. It was in the simplicity of that moment, in the honesty of affection, in the presence of a good woman whose value could not be measured in figures. He, who had searched for a qualified maternal figure, finally understood that the only qualification that mattered was the capacity to love. A year later, the Sterling mansion was an unrecognizable place. The walls, once imbued with sadness and tension, now echoed with the laughter of a happy child. Sophie flourished, transforming into a talkative, curious, and self-confident little girl, living proof of the transformative power of a loving environment. The relationship between Richard and Clara also evolved. Gratitude and respect gave way to a deep and silent affection. He no longer saw her as the woman who had saved his daughter, but as the partner who had saved his soul, the person who had taught him to be a father and to feel again. They were no longer three broken pieces. They were a family, united by a daily choice to care for one another. On a Sunday afternoon, in the same garden where Veronica had sown her intrigues, Richard made the proposal that would seal their future. "I don't want you to just be my daughter's caregiver, Clara. I want you to be my partner in life." Before she could answer, little Sophie, as if understanding the importance of the moment, ran to them. Looking at Clara with her big, hopeful eyes, she asked her own question, "Can I call you Mom?" It was a dual proposal, one from the man who had rediscovered love, and another from the child who had never lost it. Before this family that had chosen her, Clara's heart finally felt at home. Clara's tears, this time, were of pure joy. She accepted both proposals, to be a wife and to officially be a mother. Their wedding was a small, intimate ceremony in the garden, a place that now symbolized not the plots of the past, but the blossoming of their love. There were no hundreds of guests, only those who had witnessed and supported their journey. The house, once a stage for lies and cruelty, became the setting for a celebration of truth. Seeing Richard, Clara, and Sophie together, the three of them laughing under the sun, the guests saw not a businessman, a former housekeeper, and an orphan. They saw the purest and most powerful image of a complete and happy family. Their story began with the cry of a child in a house broken by grief, almost destroyed by malice, but it was transformed by the simplest and yet most powerful force in the universe, the unconditional love of a good-hearted woman for a lonely little girl. Richard learned that being a father was not about providing, but about being present. And Clara learned that a heart can indeed heal and love again. For in the end, they discovered that a real family is not defined by blood ties or a surname, but by the courage to choose love, and by the certainty that a true home is simply the place where the heart feels safe. A story that proves that love can heal and build the most beautiful families. If you were moved by the journey of Clara, Richard, and Sophie, subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. Let's celebrate the love that chooses, that cares, and that stays.